Hello again. Zone focusing is a very simple focusing technique that can really take your photography to the next level, especially for street photographers. So in today's video, I'm going to cover what is zone focusing, what are the benefits of zone focusing, and very importantly, how do you do it? I'm going to separate this video into chapters, so if you want to skip straight to the part about how to do it, please feel free to do so. So let's get into it. So what is zone focusing? So as you probably know, the wider the aperture you have on your lens, the more narrow the depth of field. So things behind and in front of the subject are less likely to be in focus. On the other side, if you use a very small aperture, then you have a wider depth of field. What that means is that more of the items that are in front of and slightly behind your subject will still be in acceptable focus. So zone focusing takes advantage of this knowledge and allows you to set the focus in a way that you'll know that everything within a certain zone will be in acceptably sharp focus. Zone focusing is sometimes misunderstood or confused with other kinds of focusing techniques. So there is also pre-focusing and also hyperfocal distance focusing. In a way, zone focusing is a kind of pre-focusing, but normally pre-focusing is where you set the focus to a specific distance and then you wait for the subject to reach that distance and then you click the shutter. So for example, if someone was running towards you very, very quickly and you wanted to photograph them running, it's very hard to focus as they're moving. The distance between them and the camera is constantly changing. So what you can do is pre-focus at a specific point, and when the runner hits that point, you click the shutter. So that would be pre-focusing. And hyperfocal distance focusing is a kind of zone focusing, but what it is doing is you're setting the zone in a way that everything from say 2 meters to infinity will be in focus. And that's more useful for say landscape photography, because you want everything from a certain point all the way to the back of the image, all the way in the distance, to be in focus. For street photography, that is not always necessary or desirable. So zone focusing does not have to make everything all the way to infinity in focus. Now we'll move on to the benefits, or why would you want to do zone focusing? So I think the first benefit and the most important one is it's extremely fast. If you know what you're doing, it can actually be faster than autofocus, because you don't have to put the focus point onto the subject. You can just lift your camera to your eye, or just lift your camera and point it in the direction of the subject and just click the shutter, knowing that as long as it's in that zone of focus range, you'll get an acceptably sharp photo. And of course, in street photography, speed can be very, very important, because scenes can change very, very quickly. You might be capturing a moment that a second later is already gone and lost forever. And so that very short time that you might have spent composing or focusing manually could be the difference between getting the shot and missing the shot. So the second benefit of zone focusing is that you will have more of your photos in focus and less of them that are blurry or out of focus. And I think we've all been there. We've come home thinking we've got a great shot and it's a fantastic scene, but unfortunately we haven't nailed the focus and the photo could be rendered unusable. And the final benefit of zone focusing for me, there may be more that you can think of, but the final benefit is it's very discreet. Because you're not spending a lot of time composing the image and trying to get the image in focus, you can be very quick, and so therefore it's much less likely that you'll be detected or noticed while you're taking your shot, because it's so fast. And often in street photography, not being noticed allows us to get a much better picture, because often once somebody notices you, they often stop doing what they're doing, or stop doing what it was that made you want to take their photo in the first place. Okay, so those are the benefits, and now we're going to move on to how to do it. So zone focusing is a manual focus technique, so you do need to set your camera to manual focus. And ideally you'd have a lens that does allow manual focusing. And if it does allow manual focusing, usually there will be some markings on the lens, like you can see in this example here. So here you can see that if we set the aperture to f11 and the focal distance to 1 meter, what this tells you is that at f11 and focusing at 1 meter, everything from 0.7 meters to 2 meters away from the camera will be in acceptably sharp focus. And so this is very important. For zone focusing to work well, you do need to have a relatively small aperture. And so really I would say f8 or really f11 at the very least. And in order to get to this aperture, depending on the lighting conditions at the time, you may need a high ISO if it's not very bright. But if it's a bright sunny day, you may be able to have a very small aperture and still have a relatively low ISO. And so just to give another example, in this example we've set the aperture to f16, so we've got a much smaller aperture and therefore a wider depth of field. So then you can see again from the lens markings, if we set the focal distance to 2 meters, so what this is telling you on the lens is that everything from around 1 meter or just over 1 meter all the way to infinity almost will be in acceptably sharp focus. And the reason we've got a bigger range is partly because we've got a smaller aperture, but also partly because we've got a longer focal distance. So how wide or how big the zone of focus is will depend on several things. It does depend on the aperture, of course. It'll depend also on the distance of the subject to the camera. So if the subject is very close to the camera, the depth of field will be narrower. And if the subject is further away from the camera, then the depth of field will be wider. Now, of course, there are three elements to exposure. We've already talked about the aperture, and we've also talked about ISO, but there is also the shutter speed. Now, in general, if you're doing street photography and you want to do zone focusing, it is better to have a faster shutter speed, because if your shutter speed is too slow, say 1/60th of a second, then what you may find is you'll get blur, because if the subject is moving, so for example walking across the frame, a shutter speed of 1/60th will not freeze that action and they will be blurred. And that is okay if that's what you're going for, but in general you might want a non-blurry photo and you'll need a faster shutter speed. So my recommendation is ideally a minimum shutter speed of 1/250th of a second and above. And on my particular camera, I can actually program it so that that is the minimum shutter speed. And then if it's brighter, it'll just automatically choose a faster shutter speed based on the aperture and the ISO. 1/250th of a second is normally fast enough for general street photography. Unless a subject is moving very, very fast, you may need to go even higher, for example, up to 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second. And conversely, if the subject is almost stationary, you may be able to get away with a slightly slower shutter speed, say 1/125 or even 1/60th of a second. So what do you do if your lens doesn't have any markings like mine does on the lens? Can you still do zone focusing? Well, actually you sort of can. It's a little bit more complicated. You might need to, for example, to set the distance, you might need to measure out, say, 6 feet. So if you find a wall and then walk 6 feet away from the wall, then you autofocus the camera on the wall, so you know that it's set to 6 feet, and then you disable autofocus, so it's stuck on 6 feet, it won't ever move, and then you can then do your zone focusing based on that. In order to find out what those parameters are, there are actually free online distance calculators which you can use to calculate your zone of focus even if you don't have lens markings. So I'll put a link in the description below to one of those free online distance calculators. And really that's it. That's zone focusing. That's how you do it and the benefits. Zone focusing works really, really well when combined with shooting from the hip. And if you want to know more about shooting from the hip, you can watch my video just here where I talk about how to do shooting from the hip to get great street photos. So thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful. If you did find it useful, please do like and subscribe to the channel. It does help me, and I'll see you in the next video.